everybody. I apologize firstly for a little bit of laryngitis, but we're here to read and I hope you enjoy it. The story I'm doing today is called The Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins. He was actually a man from England who created what people thought they looked like back in the 1800s. So he was a real person, did all this work, and I wanted to share it with you because I like dinosaurs as well. So let's see what we're going to find out about him. The Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins, an illuminating history of Mr. Waterhouse Hawkins, artist and lecturer, by Barbara Curley as the author, with drawings by Brian Selznick, and many of which are based on the original sketches of Mr. Hawkins. A true dinosaur story in 3 ages, from a childhood love of art to the monumental dinosaur sculptures at the Crystal Palace in England to the thwarted work in New York Central Park. It's all here. The first age, London. Horse-drawn carriages clattered down the streets of London in 1853. Gentlemen tipped their hats to ladies passing by. Children ducked and dodged on their way to school. But Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins had no time to be out and about. Waterhouse, as he liked to be called, hurried to his workshop in a park south of town. He was expecting some very important visitors. He didn't want to be late. As he neared his workshop, Waterhouse thought of the hours he'd spent outside as a boy. Like many artists, he had grown up sketching the world around him. By the time he was a young man, he'd found his true passion, animals. He loved to draw and paint them, but what he really loved was sculpting models of them. Through his care and hard work, they seemed to come to life. Now Waterhouse was busy with a most exciting project. He was building dinosaurs. His creations would prowl the grounds of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's new Art and Science Museum, the Crystal Palace. Even though the English had found the first known dinosaur fossils many years before, and the bones of more dinosaurs had been unearthed in England since then, in 1853, most people had no idea what a dinosaur looked like. Scientists weren't sure either, for the only fossils were some bits and pieces, a tooth here, a bone there, but they thought that if they studied a fossil and compared it to a living animal, they could fill in the blanks. And so, with the help of scientist Richard Owen, who checked every muscle, bone, and spike, that's exactly what Waterhouse was doing. He wanted to create such perfect models that anyone, a crowd of curious children, England's leading scientists, even the Queen herself, could gaze at his dinosaurs and see into the past. Waterhouse threw open the doors to his workshop. Nervously, he tidied up here and there. His assistant came, then Richard Owen. At last, the visitors arrived, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. The Queen's eyes grew wide in surprise. Waterhouse's creatures were extraordinary. How on earth had he made them? He was happy to explain. The iguanodon, for instance, had teeth that were quite similar to the teeth of an iguana. The iguanodon then was surely looking like a giant iguana. The iguanodon that Waterhouse pointed out had bones and helped determine the model's size and proportion. And another bone, almost a spike, most likely sat on the nose, like a rhino's horn. Just so for the megalosaurus. Start with its jawbone, compare it to the anatomy of a lizard, fill in the blanks, and voila, a dinosaur more than 40 feet long. Waterhouse was also making ancient reptiles and amphibians. While Richard Owen could imagine their shapes, it took an artist to bring them to life. Designing the creatures was only the first step. There was still the monumental task of building them. Waterhouse showed his guests the small models he'd made, correct in every detail, from the scales on their nose to the nails on their toes. With the help of his assistants, he had formed the life-size clay figures and created molds from them. Then he erected iron skeletons, built brick foundations, and covered the whole thing with cement casts from dinosaur-shaped molds. It is no less, Waterhouse concluded, than building a house upon 4 columns. In the weeks to follow, Waterhouse basked in the glow of the Queen's approval, but he would soon face a much tougher set of critics, England's leading scientists. Waterhouse wanted to be accepted into this circle of eminent men. What would they think of his dinosaurs? But there was only one way to find out. Waterhouse would show them. But why not do it with a little style? A dinner party, on New Year's Eve, no less, and not just any dinner party. Waterhouse would stage an event that no one would ever forget. He sketched 21 invitations to the top scientists and supporters of the day, with the words inscribed on a drawing of a pterodactyl wing. He pored over menus with the caterer. The iguanodon mold was hauled outside. A platform was built, a tent erected. As the hour drew near, the table was elegantly set. The names of famous scientists, the fathers of paleontology, were strung above the walls. All was ready. With great anticipation, Waterhouse dressed for the occasion in his finest attire. He was ready to reveal his masterpiece. And when the guests arrived, they gasped with delight. Waterhouse smiled as he signaled for the dinner to begin. With solemn formality, the footman served course after course on silver platters. Up and down the steps of the platform they carried the lavish feast. Rabbit soup, fish, ham, even pigeon pie. For dessert there were nuts, pastry, pudding, and plums. 2 footmen stayed busy by simply pouring the wine. For 8 hours, the men rang in New Year's. They laughed and shouted. They made speech after speech, toasting Waterhouse Hawkins. All the guests agreed the iguanodon was a marvelous success. By midnight, they were belting out a song they created especially for the occasion. The jolly old beast is not deceased. There's life in him again. The next few months passed in concrete, stone, and iron as Waterhouse put the finishing touches on his dinosaur. Inside the iguanodon's lower jaw, he signed his work, B. Waterhouse Hawkins, Builder, 1854. The models were now ready for the grand opening of the Crystal Palace at Sydenham Park. 40,000 spectators arrived at the Regal Cemetery ceremony. In the sun-filled center court, Waterhouse mingled with scientists and foreign dignitaries. At last, the Queen arrived. The crowd cheered, hurrah! Cannons boomed, music swelled, and a choir of 1,000 voices sang. Waterhouse bowed before the Queen. Then she and Prince Albert invited the spectators to enjoy the amazing sights. Waterhouse hurried to the lake and waited for the crowds to arrive. First 2, then 10, then a dozen more. They gasped, they shrieked, they laughed and cried. So this was a dinosaur. Waterhouse was thrilled, for in addition to being an artist, he also saw himself as a teacher. He was convinced that the best way for people to learn about anything was to see it. With this love of art and teaching, he knew he could do more. Educational posters, small models anyone could buy, lectures, books to illustrate. For the next 14 years, Waterhouse did it all. News of his success reached America. In 1868, Waterhouse traveled to New York City, filling a lecture hall for talks about dinosaurs, evolution, even dragons. As he spoke, he sketched such marvelous illustrations that the audience burst into applause. And then Waterhouse received a delightful surprise, a letter from the head of Central Park inviting him to build an American dinosaur. His models would inhabit a museum planned for the park's southwest corner. Waterhouse was excited. America's first 2 dinosaurs, Hadrosaurus and Laelaps, had only recently been discovered. Here was his chance to bring these dinosaurs to life for all to see. The second age, America. Waterhouse set right to work. He spent the next 6 months traveling to American museums to learn about American dinosaurs. Again, he built something no one had ever seen, the first model of a complete dinosaur skeleton. He presented the Hadrosaurus to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, where it was welcomed with great enthusiasm. Now Waterhouse was ready to build his dinosaurs. He returned to New York City to the workshop built for him in Central Park. He hired an assistant, and then the real work began. Small models, life-size clay figures, iron skeletons, dinosaurs. While he and his assistants toiled inside, workmen began building the museum. Like the Crystal Palace, the Paleozoic Museum would be an enormous structure of iron and glass with a beautiful arched ceiling. Day after day, the workmen dug the foundation. Then disaster struck. William Boss Tweed, a corrupt politician who controlled much of New York City, said the museum was a waste of money. At 6 feet tall and 300 pounds, Boss Tweed was a big man with an even bigger thirst for power. He reorganized the Parks Department and put his own men in charge. Waterhouse watched in dismay as work on the museum stopped. He began looking for a new home for his dinosaurs, but he was frustrated that a thieving scoundrel could thwart almost 2 years of work. In March of 1871, Waterhouse gave a speech at the New York Lyceum of Natural History. He stressed the importance of science and art, then shared the troubles he'd had with the boss. I trust, however, Waterhouse concluded, that in time the good sense of the people will awaken and they will realize the vast importance of my work. The audience agreed. One man called the boss greedy. Another said that the boss was an enemy of mankind. The New York Times printed it all. Waterhouse carried on with his work, but on May 3rd, his dream was shattered. Vandals broke into his workshop. Wielding sledgehammers, they smashed the dinosaurs. Then they carted the pieces outside and buried them in the park. Waterhouse arrived to find chaos, chunks of rubble, mangled wire, plaster shards, and dust. He simply could not believe it. Waterhouse stumbled outside only to find mounds of dirt and dinosaur rubble. 2 years of his life utterly ruined. This could only be the work of Boss Tweed. The more Waterhouse thought about it, the angrier he became. He protested to the Parks Department. The situation was outrageous, criminal. Surely something could be done. But Waterhouse was bluntly told not to waste his time with dead animals when there were so many living ones around. Waterhouse staggered away. His dinosaurs were broken, and so was his spirit. But in spite of the boss, Waterhouse would give America her first dinosaurs. He left New York to create towering hadrosaur skeletons for Princeton University in New Jersey and the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. He stayed on at Princeton, yet again creating something no one had ever seen before, the first series of paintings showing the development of life on Earth, including his beloved dinosaurs. Waterhouse was now 71 years old. It was time to go home. The third age, home again. Waterhouse returned to London, and exciting news. 30 iguanodon skeletons had been discovered in a coal mine in Belgium. It now appeared that Waterhouse's beloved iguanodon might have walked upright on its hind feet, and the spike on the nose, like a rhino's horn, might actually be its thumb. Imagine that. Waterhouse settled back into his cottage, Fossil Villa, near Crystal Palace, and on pleasant afternoons, as he walked through the park and his marvelous creations, he wondered, what other surprises will scientists dig up as they search the world for dinosaurs? Just as he had hoped, his models were the start of something wonderful, the world's first encounter with these ancient animals. People still came to the Crystal Park in England to see the dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins. And while his American dinosaurs no longer stand somewhere buried in Central Park, pieces of his dinosaurs remain. That is the story of Waterhouse Hawkins, all the work he did, all the things he believed in, and everything he did to help create what people knew as dinosaurs. Thank you for listening today. Coming in.
Good morning. I'm Sharon Kimball, and I have another story for you today. Bonjour, Mr. Satee by Tommy DePaula. It begins with a postcard. It says, Monsieur Satee et son ami Forti sur les Champs-Élysées avec la Tour Eiffel. Oh my goodness, what is that? It means Mr. Satee and his friend Forti on the Champs-Élysées with the Eiffel Tower. He says, Paris, my dear niece and nephew, my traveling companion Fortusk and I will be arriving from Paris very soon to spend the summer with all of you. What adventures we have to tell you about. Love, your Uncle Satee. It's addressed to Rosalie and Conrad Abbey, 110 Main Street, Centerville, Midwest, USA. And it says par avion, which means it's coming airmail. And we see boats, trains, and a taxi. Tommy DePaula. Bonjour, Mr. Satee. Ever since the postcard arrived from Paris, Rosalie and Conrad have been waiting for the arrival of their uncle, Mr. Satee, world traveler, and his companion, Fortusque Follette, Esquire. Every day they ask Mama and Papa when they would arrive. Hello, hello, Uncle Satee, cried Rosalie and Conrad. Hello, hello, Mr. Fortusque Follette. Hello, hello, everyone, cried the visitors, and they all hugged and kissed and went inside. Now that we're here, my dears, Mr. Satee said, Forty is going to cook us a fabulous French dinner. A special recipe from Alice and Gertrude, our dear American friends living in Paris, said Forty, and off he went to the kitchen. What adventures did you have this trip, Uncle Satee? Rosalie and Conrad asked. Well, mes enfants, do you remember my friend Pablo, who painted the portrait of me in blue? Well, his new paintings are very different. They caused quite a stir in Paris this spring. Oh, tell us, cried the children. Well, it all began the Sunday we arrived in Paris. Forty and I were sitting in our favorite cafe when who should come along but Pablo. Come and join us. What have you been up to? Pablo was always up to something. Ah, Satee, Pablo said. I have been painting many things. I went from blue to pink, from pink to things African, and now my paintings show things from different sides all at the same time. My goodness, Pablo, said Forty. How daring. I can't imagine how they look. I must see your newest paintings, said Mr. Satee. And you shall, indeed you shall, said a large woman who had come up behind them. It was Gertrude with her friend Alice. Nothing delighted Gertrude and Alice more than to bump into old friends. Come with us to the Rue de Fleurus for our Sunday night gathering, Gertrude said. Tonight, Pablo will show us his new work. Oh, do, oh, please do, said Alice. All of Paris was interested in art. Gertrude's salon, for that is what the Sunday night gathering was called, was the place where the interesting people came to discuss interesting things. Everyone was glad to see Mr. Satee. Bonjour, Mr. Satee. The salon was already filled with people. How they talked, how they laughed, how they argued. Suddenly, everyone was quiet. Henri had come in. Henri was a painter too. He looked a little bit like a bank clerk. Henri, said Gertrude. You are back from Nice so soon. Nice is in the south of France. Was Nice nice? Yes, Gertrude, Henri said. Nice was nice, and I did some nice paintings in Nice. I have brought them to show you. Pablo glowered. Oh dear, Satee, Forty whispered. I smell trouble. But I am showing my new paintings tonight, said Pablo. Gertrude said I could. Pablo put his paintings against one wall. Henri put his paintings against the other. Everyone started talking at once, taking sides. Pablo is brilliant. Henri is boring, shouted one group. Henri is a genius. Pablo is weird, shouted the other group. Oh, 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 cried Alice. A duel, the Russian prince shouted. A prize fight, yelled the American writer. Call the gendarmes, screamed Pablo's wife. Enough, 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 bellowed Gertrude, and they all stopped at once. We shall have a contest, Gertrude announced. Pablo and Henri will hang their paintings in Monsieur V's gallery, and someone will judge them. But who will be the judge? Asked the lady poet from England. Well, Fortus Follette spoke up. There is one among us who not only knows all about paintings, but is fair and honest and true. And that is my dear friend, Mr. Satee. Yes, 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 said Gertrude, and everyone agreed. All of Paris buzzed. All of Paris was interested. All of Paris held its breath. The day of the judging arrived. Gertrude and Alice, Pablo and Henri and Forty accompanied Mr. Satee to the gallery. A huge crowd followed. Reporters from all the newspapers were there. Monsieur V greeted the crowd and led Mr. Satee inside. On these pages, we see Mr. Satee looking at Henri's pictures on the left and Pablo's pictures on the right. And they are very, very different artists. Finally, Mr. Satee appeared at the door. Well, Satee, Gertrude asked. After careful consideration, said Mr. Satee, I have concluded that to compare Henri's paintings of Nice with Pablo's paintings of newspapers, guitars, and faces from all different sides would be to compare apples and oranges. Both are delicious, but taste totally different. Pablo's and Henri's paintings are also both delicious, but look totally different. I declare the contest a draw. The crowd cheered. Vive Pablo! Vive Henri! Vive Mr. Satee! Gertrude and Alice gave Mr. Satee big kisses because he had saved the day. After all, they loved both Henri and Pablo. Pablo and Henri shook hands with each other, and then with Mr. Satee. The crowd cheered and lifted Henri, Pablo, and Mr. Satee onto their shoulders and marched down the boulevard to the cafe, where they had a party. So you see that art is alive and well in Paris, said Mr. Satee. Rosalie and Conrad clapped their hands. Dinner's ready, announced Forty, and they all went into the dining room and sat down to a delicious meal. And now for some presents, said Mr. Satee. Paint sets, shouted Conrad. From Paris, cried Rosalie. And tomorrow we will go out and paint together, said Mr. Satee. And every day for the rest of the visit, Mr. Satee, Rosalie, and Conrad painted their pictures. A note from the author. During his lifetime, my good friend Mr. Satee traveled all over the world and had many adventures. I'm honored that he chose to pass them on to you. If some of the people he meets on his journeys look and sound familiar, I'm not the least bit surprised. Maybe you know that Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse are truly artists who painted a long time ago. You could look up their paintings, perhaps. This has been Bonjour, Mr. Satee. Thank you. Hello, I'm Sharon Kimball, and welcome to Storytime. Today I have a story about a mischievous cat, but it all turns out pretty well. It's called Rotten Ralph. It's written by Jack Gantos and illustrated by Nicole Rubel. Ralph is Sarah's rotten cat, but Sarah loves him anyway. When Sarah practices ballet, Ralph makes fun of her. One afternoon when Sarah was swinging, maybe both, Rotten Ralph sawed off the branch. The very next day, Ralph ruined Sarah's party. He had taken a bite out of every one of her cookies. Sometimes you are very hard to love, Ralph, said Sarah. One day, Sarah's father came home early from work. He caught Ralph sitting in his favorite chair. Ralph was wearing father's slippers and blowing soap bubbles through his best pipe. You are worse than rotten, Ralph, said father. I wish you wouldn't upset father, Sarah said. The next evening, Ralph smashed his bicycle into the dining room table. Father became very angry. You better straighten up, Ralph, he said. You are a very difficult cat, Ralph, said Sarah. After dinner, Ralph was still hungry. He chased Mother's favorite birds. She was very unhappy with Ralph's behavior. One evening, the whole family went to the circus. Everyone was having a great time, but Ralph. A dog was barking in his ear. Be quiet, said Ralph. But the dog didn't stop. He kept barking and stomping his paws on the seat. So Rotten Ralph tied some balloons to the dog's collar. The dog floated up over the lion's cage. My dog, shouted the owner, but not even the man on stilts could reach him. Then Ralph saw the trapeze. He swung and knocked over the tightrope walkers. Next, he jumped on a show horse. He pushed the rider off and frightened the elephants. Rotten Ralph has gone too far this time, bellowed father. We are leaving him here. A circus is just the place where he belongs. And they left him behind. When the circus closed that night, the manager made Ralph sweep up all the popcorn. Then he had to water the camels. After that, he had to carry the barbells for the strong man. The next day, Rotten Ralph did not want to work. He refused to be the target for the knife thrower. So the circus tough men threw him in a cage. Everybody has to work around here, Buster, the tough guy said. And they locked the door. The monkeys laughed and threw banana peels at Ralph. The elephants shot peanut shells at him and squirted water on him. A week later, Ralph had grown very thin. He had only been fed stale popcorn and rotten candied apples. That night, he decided to escape. Nobody heard him as he slipped between the bars. Ralph ran from the circus and found a place to sleep in an alley. During the night, he was awakened by gangs of mean and noisy cats. The rest of the night, he hid in a trash heap. He didn't dare make a sound, even though the mice were nibbling on his toes. In the morning, he was cold and sick. He had caught an alley fever from sleeping in a trash heap. "I'm lonely," he thought, and he began to cry. He was sitting on a trash can when Sarah found him. "Oh, Ralph, I still do love you," she said. She was so happy she hugged him and gave him a kiss on his cold nose. On the way home, she told him she had been looking for him everywhere. She asked him where he had been and what he had been doing. Even Sarah's mother and father were happy to see Ralph again. "We have missed you, Ralph," they said. Ralph kept thinking about his soft bed and warm milk. He also thought about how nice it was to have a good friend like Sarah. Ralph decided never to be rotten again, except for sometimes when Mother cooked lobster for dinner. I think Ralph just couldn't resist that lobster. We know this is a make-believe story, but if you have a kitten as a friend or a cat, you know sometimes they get in trouble, but you love them anyway. That's what Rotten Ralph is about. We hope you've enjoyed this story.